Welcome to Masikhanye, Rays of Hope. We are beginning an exciting next few weeks where we are going to be concentrating on young people, the youth, with our theme, Hope in Youth. And right now we are about to start our first conversation that looks into, are we too young to change the world? And to help me look into that, I am joined by our resident pastor for the next few weeks, Pastor Blose. Pastor Blose, welcome to Masikhanye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. It's quite great to be here and to see you again.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be having you here and that you took all the time to come in and speak with us. When we look at the Bible, we get to understand that God wants things to change in this world. He wants to put this world into an end. He wants to create a new world and wants to save us, takes us to heaven, away from this place. But sometimes it's so easy to look into that and wonder, does God have a plan for this world while we are still here?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, a difficult one
Sure.
to answer in a few seconds. However, maybe to use an illustration, an example from the Bible, I always look at the story of the children of Israel
Sure.
Leaving Egypt for the Promised Land, and how God takes them out of this metropolis, this established empire, which was Egypt. And of course, yes, there were slaves in Egypt, but there was some sense of security and familiarity
Sure.
within Egypt. They had a place to stay, they knew how everything worked. And God delivers them from Egypt and from slavery,
Sure.
which is, but I look at where He takes them to. The wilderness, where nothing, where you can't predict anything.
Sure.
Nothing works the same way it did the previous day. There's so much uncertainty, so much insecurity, and so many things that could go wrong
Sure.
within the wilderness.
Sure.
But they are on their way to the Promised Land. However, God spends 40 years with them in the wilderness, right, before they reach the Promised Land. What's God doing for 40 years with them in the wilderness?
Sure.
What's God doing with them in this wilderness instead of just taking them directly and straight
Sure.
to the Promised Land? And I believe that trust in God is built in these times of uncertainty, when everything is out of our control, when anything could possibly go wrong at any given moment, where
Sure.
there's so much danger that lurks about us every single moment, that God really stands up as a protector, where we could literally run out of things to eat and food and sustenance, and God stands up as a provider, where we could have access to health, no access to health, no access to to medical care, and God stands up as someone who becomes our healer and gives us providence. And so it's not to glorify poverty in any way or to glorify lack, but I think we are in that period as a world where we live in constant danger. We live under constant threat of injustice and violence and war. And God has placed us in this wilderness, which is the world we're living in transit to paradise, in transit to eternity, so that we could learn the art of trusting Him in the wilderness. So if we can trust God with 40 years of our lives in the wilderness, and we have seen Him, become God in our lives and become things that we thought when we had no access to
Sure.
in the wilderness, then we'd have no problem trusting Him with our eternity.
Sure.
And so for me, life here on earth sort of becomes a dress rehearsal, not for us to impress God, but for God to make eternity seem worthwhile.
I love that. Now, thank you for making a good point in showing that God does indeed have a plan for this world. Maybe one of the questions that a young person watching us right now is looking at the Bible and, some of the heroes that we are made to know about, and with long beard, Abraham, and it's so easy for the young person watching us right now to look at the Bible and say, yes, I know God has got, good plans, for this world, but do those plans involve me while I'm still young? And or does God only have a place for, the more wiser, the more mature, And of course, when we think like that as young people, we forget that those that are old and mature and wiser, they were once younger as well. Why is it important for young people to believe that God also has got them in their plan? Does he?
Yeah. So it's again a beautiful question. It's a two-pronged question.
Sure.
So one is that age doesn't necessarily mean wisdom, and youth doesn't necessarily mean recklessness.
Sure.
I've seen extremely young people who are responsible, wise, and they're not exceptions, right?
Sure.
And we need to stop
Sure.
treating, the good that comes from young people as an exception.
Sure.
They are good, not because they are young, or they're not good in spite of their youth.
Sure.
They're just good people. We never say an old person is good because they are old.
Yeah.
It's not age that has made them good.
Sure.
They're just good because if age made everyone good, then we wouldn't have any old people who are bad, right?
Sure.
And so I think that's the first sort of part of your question that I want us to look into.
Sure.
And the reason why we do this is because we like to pathologize young people as the bad apples in any given community, in any given setting. So much so that when we invite them to participate in God's plan, it is always so that God can cure them of this pathology or
Sure.
this disease
Sure.
that they have.
Sure.
So God wants to use them so that he can get this evil out of them.
Sure. Sure.
But I mean, we experience and we've seen more evil in old people, especially in churches, than we have in young people.
Yeah.
And so does God have a plan for young people? Yes, he does. And it's so beautiful that any invitation in the scriptures, any text that is an invitation from God to his people has no age,
Sure.
it has no gender, right?
Sure.
And we add those later on. And so, yes, God does have young people in his plan. What's very interesting and what's beautiful about this idea of it makes no sense, for example, a 60-year-old, right, to now be expected to start running around, preaching the gospel and so forth when their bodies are failing them. And it's actually the youth that can do that work beautifully and better.
Sure.
But even more dangerously, and I like to use that phrase dangerously, is that it is when we are at our youth where we are least trusting, right? And when we are least trusting of church, of adults, of institutions, we are more likely to question. And it is in those questions and in our search for answers to those questions that we grow, that we gain new perspectives about our faith, about how to do things. That's where innovation comes from.
Sure.
When we get tired of the old and we start asking questions about how to do things innovatively, that's when innovation kicks in. And so if we don't allow young people, or if young people don't become part of the mission, we are always going to be using old tools. We are always going to be using old methods.
Okay.
We are never going to experience any innovation within the church or even within society, and we'll never ever discover new talents, new gifts that God has blessed us with, which aid in his work.
Sure. So Pastor Blose, I hope I did not interject there. Are you saying that God is not threatened, is not disturbed by the youthful vigor and innovativeness, and that it's needed in his work?
Yeah.
And would you say that the church has responded with the same posture and attitude as you are claiming God has towards youth's vigor and inventiveness, if there is such a word?
So interestingly enough, I think God actually welcomes that. God welcomes that curiosity, that idea of faith-seeking understanding, that faith that emanates from understanding, from questioning, from seeking God and seeking to understand God and to search for God. We can't operate. So, like I said, I started pastoring when I was 24.
Sure.
Yeah, in the church, and the mentorship that I received during my initial years were from, mentors and senior pastors. And what I appreciated about them is that none of them tried to duplicate themselves in me. They sort of appreciated the fact that I'm a pastor pastoring at in a different era, different time to the one that they pastored in. And I was just fortunate to get those kind of pastors, and then to help me discover what unique gifts and abilities had God given me to sort of contribute to the ministry.
Sure.
And in that sense, I find that not only helped me to grow and to experience freedom in, to allow God to use me fully and as it wished to use me. But I think it also sort of exposed the church to something unique and different, and without, sort of inflating myself here. But it did expose the church to something unique and something different. I'm getting a thought here now, and I'm just gonna say it.
Please throw it.
Right. So, and I think that's where the trick is, right? That when we are being called by God, when God wants to use us, right, it is not just in order to save us through Him using us, right? And that's how it's always sold. That get involved, start working for God so that God can use you and you'll be saved. You'll become a better person. You'll be saved from, riotous or wasteful living, right? But one of the components or elements that we miss about this idea of participating in the mission of God, because it is God's mission, is the fact that we are also allowing God to add a different flavor, unique flavor to this mission through us. That when we don't do it, then the world misses out on that unique contribution that we can make. So when you don't work, when you don't do it, when you don't speak, when you don't preach, when you don't sing, we miss out on that perspective. We miss out on those experiences that God has had with you, even at your young age. And so we are all the poorer for it because you kept quiet. You didn't say anything. And so we want, young people to do that, to ask those questions so that we're exposed to those perspectives and we grow from them. A couple of years ago, we wouldn't have thought that it was such a bad thing, for example, to say certain things to people, to speak in a certain way to people, based on issues, based on their gender, based on their skin color. Some abhorrent things were acceptable and socially acceptable even within the church a few years ago. And I know a lot of people are like, but society is becoming more sensitive. And I think, no, society is becoming wiser and society is becoming more human. Why? Because there's someone who dared to stand up and say, but hey, hang on, that's wrong. That shouldn't be allowed in this space. And so I believe...
And that has been mostly young people.
Yes, that has been mostly young people. And of course, it's uncomfortable, right, when they start doing that, because we have become so set in our ways, we have become so set in our misogyny, we have become so set in our racism that when young people raise these things, they're turning our whole world upside down. But they're not wrong for it. It's just that we have become so accustomed to something that's wrong. So yes, God welcomes, this perspective, this innovation, this questioning, this critical thinking that young people come with, because in it lies our growth, not just for them, but also for us as a community, as a church, and as society in general.
Look, we looking at the Bible, there are many characters through whom God changed the then world and the then society. I mean, from the disciples, of Jesus who were young, and Joseph, Daniel. I mean, we could talk about those exciting characters, but I know there is one character that excites you, and I want us to perhaps reflect in her life, and I'm glad that we are choosing. She's young and she's a woman, Esther.
Yeah. Yeah, you're going to get me started on a sermon here.
Let's go ahead. Let's reflect on that, because it's one thing to be young, that comes with its challenges.
Yeah.
But it's another to be young and a young woman.
Right. Yeah. And especially in a male-dominated world.
Precisely. Yeah.
And you find her, standing up to lead her people, to intervene, to use her position. Yeah. I mean, there are so many discussions and debates around her life and how she became, a wife to the king. But I mean, she uses that position, to benefit her people. Yeah. And I mean, her uncle makes sure of that, right? So there's this beautiful synergy of youth and experience, where the old voice, right, doesn't seek to govern, to police and regulate the youth, but guides gently and suggestively to say, hey, you're not called into this position, you're not given this privilege, you're not given access to these resources just for yourself, because your faith, your life is not just some kind of private entity. It is supposed to be lived within community. How does your access to all these other things, how do you use your position to benefit, your community? And so there's this presence of this old voice. So when we say allow young people space and room to function and to work, to operate, to be of use to God, we are not saying then silence and discard the elderly or the wise, as we'd like to say.
Yeah. The experience.
Yes, let me use that word, the experience. But what we're saying is that the experience needs to be present. And I think that at times, sometimes that's why we stand in the way of young people, because we're afraid of being obsolete, of losing our youth as old and experienced. And I've got gray hairs now, so I can claim that. But you've got this, relationship between Esther and her uncle, guiding her. And of course, she does adhere, and she does, respond positively to this advice. Another example, just to quickly go through, is Samuel and Eli, right? And you've got this young man, right, who hears God's voice in Eli's absence. And again, when we see young people stand up to, in the middle of the night to say things that are inconvenient to us during our time of rest, it's very easy to dismiss them as, being hallucinating and dreaming of things. But they've heard the voice of God. And the reason why we dismiss them is because we were not a part of that conversation when God really spoke to them. So what do you do as an Eli when a young person comes to you with a message from God, or with a claim that God has spoken to them or shown them this in His Word, right? How do you respond to that, right? You don't dismiss it. You don't police it. You assist in helping them to position themselves in order to hear God more, or to hear more of God, and then gently guide that, because sometimes the excitement of discovering something new doesn't necessarily always lead to acting wisely and responsibly. And so there's that need, for guidance, so that people can really become, and we can get to experience what God has said to them and what God has given them for us as well. Yeah. And so when I see you preach, it's not just about you, becoming a prominent preacher, a famous preacher, but it's a message through you for me. Us. Yeah. And so I support you, because I want God to give you more messages for me. Right.
Pastor Blose, thank you so much for those thoughts. And this is where we're going to end. I'm really looking forward to the next 3 conversations with you.
And thank you so much, man. Pleasure to be here.
Viewers, I trust that you enjoyed that conversation. It is just the beginning. Please do not go away. We'll be back after the
break. A blessed family life is not a given. Happy and strong families are built through guidance and help. The Cape Conference Virtual Pastor is here. Chat with a pastor that has experience in lifestyle, relationships, trauma, and loss counseling. Chat with the Cape Conference Virtual Pastor on weekdays 3 to 8 p.m.
Welcome back to Masikhanye, Rays of Hope. And to help me continue with our discussion and conversation today on being too young to change or not to change the world, I am joined by another young person who is working in the investment space and is often a social commentator and speaker. His name is Patrick Matabeni. Mr. Matabeni, welcome to Masikhanye.
Thank you, Sylvia.
And I'm really excited to be having you here.
Same
here.
I'm good. I'm good. And how are you?
I'm good, thanks. You would know the French psychiatrist and political philosopher, Frantz Fanon. His words, and I want to start with them, and I'm going to read them to you. Each generation must, out of a relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And when you look at the young people of 1976, whose contribution and work we are commemorating and celebrating this month, they seem to have been following this idea that young people should galvanize and organize around one primary idea for their generation. What are your thoughts, to this idea? Is it necessary for people, young people of every generation, to agree on one specific mission?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned firstly, Transvanon. I think definitely one of the writers that have shaped my intellectual life personally. And then coming into the 1976 moment, and I think it's a very important moment, a moment that belongs to the Black Consciousness movement. And I'm saying that, understanding that, historically there's been a contestation around this moment. And I think it's an important moment where people like Tsetse Mashinini, Khoto Seitlolo, who were under the tutelage, I would say, of Ongopuze Tiro, a very close ally to or comrade of Steve Biko. So, and if you think about these guys, how they rallied around the question of their existence at that time.
Sure.
Right. Yes, it might have been a situation of Afrikaans being used, which ignited, right? And and you think about that moment, and you think about the moment of 2015 or 2014 or Fees Must Fall here, where there's a particular issue that ignites something. But if you think much more deeper, especially in the 96 moment, that the one issue or the one factor or common, the common goal or the common aspect which all young people at that age, these guys were pupils in high school basically, was the Black experience. And what's so important about that moment for me, which is slightly different to the Fees Must Fall moment, is the fact that these guys understood the totality of oppression. So it was not just a question of being at school and being taught in Afrikaans or fighting Bantu education at the time, but it was to understand that they exist as part of a broader society that was oppressed by apartheid at the time. And so I'm just, touching on some of the things that are so critical in terms of, bringing consciousness and that Black consciousness that Tsetse Mashinini ends up expressing, being taught by Tiro, leads us into the 96 or the 1976 moment that then sort of, blasted out and had what we had. So definitely we need one or two or a couple of common issues that we should rally around as young people.
Sure. All right, Pat. Before, of course, we discuss, later on, I'm going to end with what you think should be those rallying points. But before we get there, I think it's imperative that we touch on what are the issues, what are the social issues that are facing your generation, our generation, and because I think it can only be from those that we get to choose the one that we rally behind. But could you please just mention them?
Yeah, look, we are facing a lot of issues, but of course, I will zoom down to probably the ones that I feel are very fundamental for our generation, and I think these are not fundamentally different to previous generations. Whether I talk about I talk about the 90s during the Kotesa times, or the 80s during times of the when the Freedom Charter and these type of stuff came back in, or the 70s during Biko time, or the 60s during Somuku's time. So it's these issues are all coming from fundamental issues. One of that is landlessness, right?
The issue of the land.
So it is at the crux or at the base, it comes back to the issue of landlessness, which produces other problems that young people have. Problems of unemployment, for an example, which are problems of integration in my view, not fundamental problems that sort of got us to where we are, where you've got in this country currently over 65% of young people being unemployed. Problems of ghetto violence. I mean, if you go to, whether you go to Nyanga East or Kukuletu, or you go to Alex or Mdantsane, I mean, you're still going to find common issues of gang violence. I mean, Biko, even in the late 60s when he wrote his essays, I mean, he makes the point that for a black person to really grow up to adulthood is actually a miracle. So these are not issues. These are still issues that are pervading our society. So crime, I mean, the infestation of crime, I mean, it's incredible. Sure. So you've got a lot of young people, they are unemployed, they are given to crime on the basis of their, economic and social exclusion, lack of economic participation in this country, and I mean, in the world over.
Sure.
Police brutality, whether it comes in the form of, police shooting in the US or police shooting, young guys protesting for free education and those type of things. So these are things that are still quite prevalent in our society.
Sure. Thanks, Pat. Of course, then we come to that question that I said we're going to come to. Of these, I mean, others could add, climate change. Others could add other problems that seem to be issues in our generation. But in your worldview, number one, as a young thinker, as a young Christian, and as a young African, and what do you think should be the causes around which your generation should rally around?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's an important question, and a very difficult. I mean, it sounds simple, but it's very difficult, right?
Sure.
It is difficult because of I keep on going to Steve Biko. I mean, I really read Biko quite religiously. The fracture, how fractured we are. I mean, the fracture of resistance in South Africa, for an example, that we are shooting from different points and we are prioritizing different things. But I mean, if I were to sum these things up to say, what is this one thing that we must really organize and agonize for?
Sure.
It would be, land and economic ownership, right? And I mean, I've summed up,
Sure.
in my view, things that I consider to be quite fundamental.
Sure.
And I don't think that we should be, struggling for jobs.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. And why do you think those two things are more pressing than the others that we mentioned, or that we did not even mention, but we know exist?
Yeah, and I mean it's because all the other ones, are derivatives of, from this one.
Okay.
So these two landlessness, economic exclusion. This is like the main sin for me. Then you've got other sins, that come out of this main sin.
Sure.
And what you would find typically in a church or in a church context, or
Sure.
In the broader Christian project, is that the focus, whether that focus is from the pulpit or whether that focus is from wherever, is that the focus is on the on the outcomes, what could be called sort of, epiphenomena,
Okay.
Things that are secondary,
Sure.
Or byproducts of these two things.
Sure.
So, whether you tell people, to be morally upright, to not have premarital sex, don't steal, don't do these things, but we've not addressed, the fundamental stealing.
Okay.
The institutionalized stealing of, landlessness, the economic realities in our country where you've got 5% or 10% of few families in Stellenbosch or wherever that owns basically 80% of the economy. So I mean, it's those type of things.
I'm sorry for interjecting. I think you're saying something very, very, very important. And of course, you are not saying that personal sins should not be spoken against or even people encouraged to overcome. But what I hear you to be saying is that the church has for too long spoken against personal sins while they say very little against social and systematic sins that make personal sins even an attraction. I mean, if you're going to say to a young person who's jobless, do not drink, and yet sometimes drinking is the only way they can medicate and forget the needy situations that they're in. Did I get you correctly?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, this is what Biko calls petty sins, for an example, to say, because these are symptoms, of
something deeper,
of something much deeper. So I mean, if the church wants to really come close to transforming society, I mean, it needs to deal with these fundamental problems. And of course, I'm not saying that we shouldn't go out and do charity or go out and give food to the needy, right? We should be doing that. But that's just one leg of the problem. In fact, that's just a byproduct of the problem. But we must be talking about these other fundamental issues.
I like that. We should feed the poor, but we should also ask why they are hungry.
Yeah.
Sure.
Definitely.
All right. And now, as a young person and as somebody who's involved and who cares about young people in every dimension of their lives, how would you want the church in particular to assist and empower and enable young people to face the challenges of their generation, this generation in particular?
Yeah, that's a fairly deep question. But I mean, I really think that, it starts with the theology, in my view. It starts with the theology. Right now, we can ask how many churches or, how many pastors are really, expressing things like liberation theology. It starts there, getting the right theology, getting the right philosophy that can trickle down so that you've got a right template and a right thinking to be able to then have that urge to say, I need to go out and do something. That I need to go out and really transform the society that I'm under, as opposed to just telling people that you are just gonna go, you're just gonna be going to heaven one day, and you must endure the suffering here because the morning is coming. So while that is important, of course, looked at deeply, but we need a theology that takes into account the importance of social realities as well. So, and I think it starts there. But of course, we can have a much more quite elaborated conversation about this.
It's a pity we don't have enough time to do that. But Pat Matabeni, thank you so much for joining Masikhanye.
Thank you.
Viewers, I trust that you were stimulated and challenged by that conversation with Pat Matabeni. We are not yet done. Please stay tuned. We'll be back soon.
Putting God first can be difficult. In this video, we'll explore what we can learn from Moses to help us put God first in our lives today. Now, Moses tried to save the people through his own power. It didn't work. He was banished from Egypt, and his dreams were dead. After decades of working as a shepherd in the desert, something strange happened to Moses. God called him to revive the dreams of his youth, to see the people of Israel freed from slavery. But the thing is, Moses wasn't ready. He could no longer speak properly and believed he was too old to challenge Pharaoh. He was right about that, but God told him, "Who has made man's mouth? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say." God told him the same he is telling us today. For Moses, putting God first meant refusing to rely on his own ability and strength. It meant putting his whole life in God's hand and accepting the call based on God's power. Because he had this not-so-confident mindset, God would be able to work through him, delivering his entire nation from slavery. Now, just like God called Moses, you too are called to put him first in your life. There's a special mission that can only be achieved if you decide to put God first in your life. It's not easy, but through the Holy Spirit, you can realize that divine strength is found only by trusting God while acknowledging your own weaknesses. Moses put God first, and his example compels us to do the same. As we return the tithe and promise, we are challenged to put God first.
Welcome back to Masikhanye, Rays of Hope, as we continue with our special feature on hope in youth, a special feature for the Youth Month. Right now, to look into the topic of how to make your voice heard, I am joined by Zwonaka Netshifulani, who is a social commentator and a deputy director at the Office of the Deputy Chief Justice in South Africa. Zwonaka, welcome to Masikhanye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know how busy you are.
Anytime.
Thank you. And I mean, you are a deputy director looking into content management and the relationship management. What does that really entail in the Deputy Chief Justice's office?
It's a very long title for researcher.
Sure.
But that's basically what I do. I am a researcher, legal researcher in the office of the DCJ. I assist him and the office with any and all research needs. There's a variety of other tasks that are very difficult to kind of categorize and articulate. But that's basically it. Kind of a general dog's body. As and when needs arise in the office, I kind of exist to help him deal with them.
Yeah.
But primarily research.
Once again, thank you, Zwonaka. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you. And of course, like we said at the beginning, we are looking into the Youth Month. Maybe the first question, and I know many young people have, can we be too young to even think about changing the world and having an impact and a dent on the social challenges that are facing our world?
I don't think so. I know ladies generally don't tell their age, but I'm 31. And I was telling Pastor Blose at breakfast earlier that I'm a year older than Steve Biko was when he died. I think I'm about 2 years older than John the Baptist was when he died. I realized recently that for all of his kind of strength and persona as this massive, great prophet, he was around the same age as Jesus. So he would have been only 30 or so when he was beheaded. I always thought of him as a very old, ancient man. So that was mind-boggling for me. So no, I don't think there's such a thing as too young. Jesus was only 33 when he died. So 2 years from now, I will be the same age. So I don't think there's anything such as too young. Greta Thunberg, who somehow managed to earn the ire of an entire U.S. president, is only 16 or 17. Malala was 15 when she took a bullet to the head from the Taliban. So I don't think there's such a thing as too young at all. Sometimes you're forced and thrust into history perhaps a little younger than you might have intended. I sincerely doubt Malala's plan for her life included what happened to her, but here she is, a global icon for education for girls. Definitely don't think John the Baptist planned to have his head on a pike at a party, but there he was at 30, already having such a massive public profile, and being able to take on men much older than him in preparation for his equally young cousin, Jesus. So I don't think there's any such thing as being too young to make history. Youth Month that we are in right now was galvanized by images of a teenager who many people call a struggle icon, but who one of my favorite lawyers has said was a child caught in the crossfire. and here we are kind of galvanized into action by the sight of his lifeless body in school uniform, running through the streets of Soweto. So there's no such thing. Sometimes you're forced into it before you're ready, and sometimes you're kind of galvanized by life and you take a public platform like your Bikos. But no.
Sure.
There's never such a thing as too young.
I mean, what do you think when somebody says, actually, we are too young not to change it? Because if you are young, the younger you are, the most life you will have to live on this world. So if there's anybody who should be changing this world, it is the young.
Yes, because you are going to have to live with the consequences of what the world is. And if you kind of sit down on your laurels, it's another 70 or so years of this life that you are resigned to and quiet about and not active and not participating in. Whereas the most vocal people have, 20 years max? And have a lot of opinions on a planet they're about to leave soon. So if anyone should have feelings about causes and social justice and movements, it's definitely the people who are young and might have to deal with the consequences of it for a little longer.
Sure. And thanks, Zwonaka. And speaking about causes, does one need to choose one particular, cause? I mean, as you know, there are so many things that are facing our generation, that are facing today. How do you, and that's the whole point of this conversation. How do you make your voice heard? And I think that starts with, what do you want to say? Do you choose one, or do you take a couple of things? Or how do you choose something or a cause that matters to you as a young person?
I think there's so many ways, and you can enter interest or spaces both as a person who's directly impacted by a struggle, so a Black person affected by race, someone living with disabilities, entering conversations about disabilities, but you can also kind of participate as an ally, somebody who is not directly affected by something, but occupies or holds enough social capital and privilege to be able to stand in allyship with people who are very deliberately silenced, sometimes by the demographic that you are a part of, or sometimes by people who have access to more social capital than the people we're kind of talking about. So I think those are the two kinds of ways. I don't think there's necessarily a way to choose just one. I think struggles are way too interconnected to be able to do that. When you enter a conversation or when you enter a space, if you want to talk about gender, eventually at some point you're going to pull on a thread about race. You're going to pull on a thread about race. You're going to pull on a thread about disability. You're going to pull on a thread about geographical location. You're going to pull on a thread about the history of certain things. Where are you located? Are you in the global north? Are you in the global south? Are you located in a country with a history of colonialism? What kind of educational opportunities do you have access to? That pulls on an additional thread. Do you have access to healthcare? Will you live long enough to realize those things? That pulls on a different thread. Why do you have access to those particular things? That then pulls on threads about race. That pulls on threads about gender. That pulls on threads about class. That pulls on threads about capitalism. You are never going to be able to simply kind of contextually and just in a silo jump into a particular cause.
Independent of the rest.
They're all so profoundly interconnected. They all sit at the center of so many different forms and lanes. They also are dominated, or different forms or causes are created almost by, in many instances, a very small number of superstructures. So many of our issues are created by capitalism. So many of our issues are created by race. So many of our issues are created by sex or gender. So you're always going to, in some form or another, have to pull on several different threads and implicate and kind of straddle different causes just to be able to articulate clearly the position you hold in the cause that you are passionate about.
And speaking about passionate causes, maybe I'm going to put you in the spotlight here. What is, you've mentioned that, it's almost impossible to have one, but are there any number or even one that is closest to your heart personally?
I think by virtue of the several sites that it straddles, very much the freedom of Black women, very much the freedom of Black children. Those are the causes that are most passionate to me, because I think those bodies, those lives, those experiences have been at the center of so many sites of oppression and harm and violence and marginalization and silencing.
Sure.
And I think if we can get that right, I think by implication, or at least that's my hope, we will have managed to, at the very least, have very difficult and painful conversations. We will have been able to reckon with very difficult histories. We will have been able to tell the truth about the state of our world and the state of relations, the state of power, the state of how the world treats the most marginalized. I think we will have accomplished much if we are able to look at children and see them completely free.
Yeah.
If we are able to look at black women and see them completely free. Because we sit in so many levels at the very bottom rung of social justice. You can't get to our freedom without having dismantled so many of the other systems that also harm so many other people, perhaps to different degrees and at different levels.
Sure. Now tell me, Zwonaka, I think it's obvious, why people would need to maybe I should phrase this question like this. Why, and if it is important at all, should people allowed to voice their own causes, number one? And of course, that does not mean that others should not be partnering with them. But how important also is it to be aware and sensitive to the myth of being the voice of the voiceless?
I think thinking that you're a voice for the voiceless comes from a position of profound privilege. You assume that you know better. You assume that you know enough. And you assume, or you're at the very least guaranteed that your voice
will be heard.
Yes, will be heard. That your articulation of the issues will be heard. And inherent in that is the very problem you're trying to fix. That people who should have access to microphones, to stages, to platforms, don't have access. And there you are, in all of your confidence and all of your privilege, convinced that you can outspeak them, which is the problem that exists in the first place. It's just an endless vicious cycle. So I think that is a myth, first of all. Two, people are extremely articulate and know better than anyone outside how to articulate their own struggles and how to express their own struggles. I did my articles at an NGO in Braamfontein called the Socioeconomic Rights Institute. And one of the first, most vivid visuals I have of working there was a documentary that we watched about a social movement in KZN called Abahlali Basemjondolo. And I remember this young man, there was a community that had just been evicted, I think by the municipality or one of the organizations that they use. And he had the Constitution open and he was reading it like a Bible. And he was saying, these are the rights that you have. This is what the government... I had never seen the Constitution used that way. For me, it was something that you studied, It wasn't something that you internalized, that you lived, that you carried around as a site of hope, that, my world will get better, that the government must, that kind of naive kind of faith that because this exists, my rights must, I'd never done that because law in many ways trains you to be very cynical. It was the most incredible image, So he's sitting there and there's people gathered around him and he opens, I think it was section 26, section 27, I can't remember. But it was about 26, it was about housing, I think, or 25, I'm not really sure.
I wouldn't know.
I also don't remember. Property 101 was years ago. So he was reading, everyone must have the right to housing, or housing includes, etc., etc. And just intoning it and repeating it over and over that I am entitled to this. This is my right. It's right here in black and white. It's in the Constitution. You can't do this to me. You can't kick me out of my home. You can't dismantle my home. Mind-boggling. I've never forgotten that visual. And that's what happens when you just keep quiet and get out of the way and not allow, but just... move, give people the room that they need to be able to articulate their struggles. Because as one of the very results of the privilege that you occupy, or the position that you occupy, that allows you to be privileged enough over people, is that you're always going to be blind to the ways in which your own privilege exacerbates or creates the conditions that require them to have a voice in the first place. You will always talk over them. You will always ignore your own complicity. You will always ignore the ways in which you benefit from the position that that person is in. So I think it's extremely important to make sure that we move out of the way as far as is possible. You get to the podium, you say, I'm not here to talk.
Hand over the mic.
The only reason I'm here is because you would only let me through the door. But the person that really needs to speak is this gentleman or this lady next to me. And you hand over the mic and you keep quiet. And you keep quiet.
Thanks for that. Look, I've got to end this conversation with this reflection and this question: the place of the law in changing the world. And should we even attempt to change the law? Is it not too big an animal? Should we just, try and hack at the leaves? And if that is important, is it possible to change the law? And how do you go about changing laws and policies such that they are conducive to the social change that we need to see in the world?
South Africa's history is such that the concept of the rule of law is extremely important.
Sure.
The concept that all bodies must access or use or act in a way that is legal and rational and justifiable in terms of the Constitution, in terms of legislation, is extremely vital. It's the cornerstone of our society. And it's one of the things that distinguishes us very much from our very recent past, from our apartheid and colonial past. So the rule of law is quite important. Laws are quite important. Legislation is quite important. And our legitimacy as a country is very much rooted on adherence to the rule of law. South Africa is currently undergoing comments on land and the expropriation bill. That's extremely important. There are many conversations happening around it. I think Advocate Ngugatobi has written out 2 books on that debate. Precisely, more and more conversations are emerging to help people contextualize how to engage with and debate this new bill and how to have conversations about this. So it's extremely important to participate in it. South Africa also takes great pride in its constitution. It's a global marvel. So that also matters. Commenting on, engaging with, at all levels of government, municipal legislation, national legislation, provincial legislation matters very much, both for being able to realize your own rights, but also for granting legitimacy and giving some measure of social power and recognition to people who are recognized and protected by certain legal instruments.
Zwonaka, I wish we could go on, but the time goes so fast.
It does.
But thank you so much for coming to join us at Masikhanye. I really appreciate having you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Our viewers, I trust that you enjoyed this conversation and the entire episode. And if you have any questions, please send an email to the address that you see at the bottom of the screen, masikhanye@cc.adventist.org. And if there's a message that you want to send, you can also use the number that you see appearing on the screen. Remember, the word of the Lord says that as you receive the light, do not hide it and do not keep it to yourself, but you go out there and make this world a better place. Until next time, Masikhanye.